Okay, so we've got some examples of cognitive biases. These are really important. It's such a big thing in psych. It comes up a lot in um, year 12 and like even like in uni as well. It's something that you come across a lot. So cognitive bias is this idea of basically not thinking, not logically, but not thinking objectively, almost as a way you could discuss it. So it's this idea of faulty decision making and making errors in your judgment. Um, so everybody suffers from everybody has cognitive biases. It's not like if you have it you're abnormal. Like everybody has these. But it's just this idea about how this has such a strong influence on our social cognition and on our behavior because we like to think of things incorrectly, basically. So these are just a couple of examples. There's like about 1 billion different types of biases out there. But these are the common ones you might come across. So actor-observer bias and self-serving bias we'll talk about in the next slide. They're kind of what I was talking about with your situational attribution and your dispositional attribution. Your anchoring bias, we'll just run through these. Your anchoring bias is basically when you put more emphasis on sort of like the first piece of information you're given. So if you are being sold something, so if you're being sold something, you might get the first price of this house, maybe, I don't know. You get the first price of this house and it's really expensive, and then you go see another house and it's really cheap. You see another house and it's cheaper. This idea of you're kind of always comparing it to that first house or to this, certain house. And the idea is that your perception or your judgment can be a little bit skewed because you might think, oh my goodness, this second house is so much cheaper than this first house. It's such a good deal. But it's this idea that maybe they're both really overpriced. Maybe this one that you perceive as so much cheaper and a really good deal is actually still expensive, and maybe it's more expensive than other things on the market. But it's that idea of anchoring bias, like an anchor. One piece of information is kind of the weight, and you're always coming back to this first piece of information. Doesn't necessarily have to be first, but like just this piece of information that's forming this sort of core of your comparison. Attentional bias is basically just like attention. It's when you pay attention to certain things and not to others. So that might be for a lot of different reasons. But yeah, in making decisions and judgments, this can lead to bias because you aren't really considering everything fairly. You're just paying attention to certain things and not to others. Confirmation bias is this idea of always trying to find information that fits in with preconceived ideas. So if you have this certain belief or sort of knowledge, you have a tendency to look for information that agrees with that rather than disagrees with that. Hence the term confirmation bias. You're drawn to things that will support the knowledge that's sitting in your head rather than being open to all sorts of information. Hopefully that makes sense. So the halo effect. Halo effect is this idea of people that you find attractive kind of being associated with other positive traits. So if you've got two people, you find one attractive, you find one less attractive, you might not know anything about them, but the person that you find more attractive, you're going to associate with perhaps, being a nicer, a kinder person, being more intelligent, that sort of thing. Whereas the person who you find less attractive, you'll perceive them as, they might be less intelligent than the other person or less kind, that sort of thing. Because you associate one positive trait with someone, you think that all of the other traits will be positive as well. That's the idea of the halo effect. Hindsight bias is this idea of thinking that things were more obvious than they actually were. So like, if you do a test and then you pass it, after you might be like, oh yeah, I knew I was going to pass. Like, oh, I knew I was going to do well in this test. When in actuality, you might have been like about to flunk the test. Like you might have not done as well. Or like if you watch a game or something, you might be like, oh yeah, I knew they were going to win. Whereas when you were watching it, maybe you weren't that sure. It's this idea of hindsight bias. You think that based on the result of something, you tend to think that you are more sort of confident in it or more towards the result than you were. Misinformation is to do with basically the fallibility of memory. So memories are very easily manipulated. And that's this idea of misinformation. So if you tell someone, it's this idea of a leading question. So often with like the police or something, if they have a witness statement, they might ask someone, what I don't know, color was their gun or something like that, or how big was their weapon. And that is what you call a leading question, because it implies that this criminal had a weapon with them. There may have been no gun, there may have been no weapon, or even like, how fast was this car going? That idea of, oh, it must be fast. And then the individual who's being asked the question, they're more likely to say, oh, yeah, it was a big weapon, or, oh, yeah, they were going pretty fast. It's this idea of misinformation and how that can change people's perception and memory. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Active observer bias and self-serving bias are kind of in here. So this is what we were discussing earlier, when basically we are like in love with ourselves and not other people. So other people, again, if they do something wrong, then we often say, oh, okay, that's due to their innate factors, that's due to their personality, it's due to their characteristics, and the situation doesn't play into it that much. We say the same thing when we do well. So when I pass a test, when I get an award, I say, oh, it's because I'm so smart, I'm so intelligent, I'm so hardworking. And it's not because, I can afford like the best resources and stuff like that. Whereas when we fail something, we'll say, oh, it's because, the resources I used were really bad, or I don't know, my teacher is really bad, or something like this. As opposed to, oh, maybe I didn't work hard enough, or maybe I was lazy. That's the idea of self-serving bias. We're always prioritizing ourselves. Whereas in other people, we tend to see particularly their faults as something that's really due to their personality. But for us, it's the other way around.